So we've spent the last couple of weeks talking about the provincial budget and reaction to said budget. The Democrats came out this week looking to talk about something else.
Yes, they did try to change the channel, as we say. They got beaten up pretty badly on the budget, and not very many people have had anything good to say about it who aren't members of cabinet and caucus. So they really wanted us to be talking about and reporting on something else. So they tried what they thought was a pretty good news event on Monday. We had a news conference in the foyer at the legislature, right outside the chamber. Bunch of kids, right? And the premier breaks the news to them that we're not going to be doing time changes anymore. We're going to be permanent daylight savings time starting this weekend. When we jump to it, we're not going to go back. Kids seemed very excited. You know, they always talk about getting validators, and these ones were pretty charming and young. And they had music, and they even had a dance along with the premier. He's not particularly light on his feet, would be my reaction, but who the hell am I to talk? In any event, that was the change, the channel thing. But when we got to the news conference, a lot of questions to the premier about something that came to light over the weekend, which was the agreement between the federal and federal government and Musqueam that recognized Aboriginal rights and title for Musqueam over, well, most of Metro Vancouver. The premier was asked about that, and that really started the week on a bad footing for the premier. He said, well, he didn't know anything about it. He hadn't seen the agreement. Ottawa hadn't shared it with him. He didn't have the text. And so you really couldn't ask him about it because he didn't know anything about it. And later that day, his office had to admit that David Eby had been present for the signing ceremony on February the 20th. They had to admit it because pictures surfaced of the premier being there. So the guy who didn't know anything about it was there for the signing, and that really, it started the week on a bad footing. And as of yesterday in the legislature, so question period there, every day the questions got tougher to the premier, and it really was a very bad week for his credibility, and a very bad week on an issue that increasingly the public is concerned, angry in some cases, confused about what our provincial and federal governments are doing on this project of reconciliation with Indigenous people.
And as you say, this was a deal, in this case, between the federal government and the Musqueam. The province was on the sidelines for this one. They say because it involves federal land.
Well, yes, but when you read the entire agreement, it's a commitment to negotiate and sort things out, but there's one of those clauses in there that also says nothing in this agreement precludes the Musqueam from asserting their rights and title in future. There's no restriction on them. They don't disavow the claim of Aboriginal title to their traditional territory, which is, I say, is most of Metro Vancouver. So it's not, I mean, yes, it's a federal agreement, but again, if Ottawa is going to be signing that kind of agreement in British Columbia, they really ought to do more to explain the public where they're headed and why. And the problem that Eby had was once it came out that he was there, the first thing you go is, well, why didn't you ask Ottawa what they were signing? You know, he is the premier of BC. He must know how big an issue this is in the province now because of some court decisions and other controversies. And of course, the other thing he and the minister, Spencer Chandler Herbert, said was, well, they didn't send us a copy, they didn't brief us. And that generated another round of controversy. This thing has gone on every day. The story's gotten worse for the government because federal minister says, well, we did brief them. We keep them in the loop on this. And then the government has to conduct an internal investigation on who was briefed. And they pinned the whole thing on a junior staffer in the Ministry of Indigenous Relations, who apparently Ottawa briefed on the fact that this agreement was coming. Well, the Premier gets very angry about that. He says there are protocols for government to government dealings, and Ottawa didn't follow them. They didn't brief the deputy minister in the Premier's office, or the Premier's chief of staff, or the minister, or the Premier himself. They just passed the news on to some junior staffer, and he says that's not good enough. Well, I think there's enough blame attached to the Premier on all of this, not least his lack of curiosity and lack of candor, that blaming Ottawa on this one, I mean, yes, the federal government needs to pay a lot more attention to what it's doing on this issue in BC too, because it's such a big deal here now, and there's so much public concern. But for the Premier to say, well, it's all Ottawa's fault, he also lashed out at the opposition. He said, well, the opposition has been misleading people about what was in this agreement. Well, the Premier himself claimed to not know what was in it, so it's not surprising that the opposition has been asking some pretty sharp questions on this issue. And again, you go, don't they realize that this issue has changed dramatically since you had a court case last August that for the first time recognized Aboriginal title over private property in Metro Vancouver, over several hundred hectares of land in Richmond, very valuable land. It's been assessed at as much as $2 billion. And all of a sudden, after people being told for years that private property wasn't on the table, it's on the table.
Well, and I would say that this even goes back a little further. You were raising concerns about lack of transparency in these kinds of conversations going back to the Sunshine Post and other cases as well. But we seem to have the provincial now and the federal government really not keeping the public apprised of what's going on.
Yeah, I think, and there's a lot of examples of the secrecy now by both levels of government and not bringing the public along. And I think there's an appearance here that the federal government and the provincial government and their lawyers and public servants and the politicians, they want to move this issue as far as they can before the public is entirely clued in on the implications. And the other thing that comes across is that all the people in charge on this, and I would include lawyers, and I would include judges, and I would include politicians at the federal and provincial level, they've all bought into the same messaging that we have to do this, that the courts have said, that we've got to recognize all this, that, First Nations decolonialization, land recognition, and all that. I understand why they're doing that and where they're coming from. I think they're going too far, but that's a different issue. But what they've not done is bring the public along with them. On the contrary, they seem bent on getting as much done as far as they can go before the public really gets clued in. And I think we are now seeing the fruits of that policy of secrecy and denial and cover-up, is a public that is very, very suspicious about what's going on. And it's undermined public support for an initiative that I think was undertaken with the best of intentions, which was to recognize that First Nations have gotten a raw deal through Canadian history, and many things needed to be done to lift them up, give them a bigger say in the society and all that. The intentions are good here, but if you go and just do all that stuff and constantly present the public with a fait accompli and say we have no choice, well, you've lost the public. And I think they are losing the public on this issue.
Well, and of course, as you know, because the courts have ruled that governments have a duty to consult with First Nations on these issues, but they didn't rule they have a duty to consult in secret. It doesn't have to be in secret.
No, I mean, a good example of what's going on right now. So you had a court case last December that found that the province's mineral claims staking legislation was incompatible with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and therefore threw the whole thing out, right? A BC Court of Appeal. So the government said, well, the court has misread our legislation, and they've gone too far. And it was not our intention that the courts would be able to overturn provincial laws on the basis of the UN Declaration. The government says its intention with legislation was to set up a framework where First Nations and the province would together update legislation to make it compatible. And that the courts were not supposed to jump in ahead of time and say, oh, yeah, this law doesn't stand up anymore. So that's the government's position. So what they're doing is they're rewording the legislation here. It's called the Declaration Act, and it dovetails with the UN Declaration. Well, okay, so that's what they're doing, but you know what they're doing. They've hired a former deputy minister in the government. They're paying him on a contract of, I don't know, some staggering amount of money, a couple $100,000, and he's taking these proposed amendments around to the 200 First Nations in British Columbia. And he's showing them the changes, and he's making them sign non-disclosure agreements. So the whole thing is going on in the back room again. Someday, the rest of us will be presented with the proposed wording of the changes. But what we'll see will again be another of these fait accomplis. It'll be worked out. The legislation itself was written with First Nations in consultation. The changes in the Heritage Conservation Act were done in a 2-year workshop with First Nations in consultation, in confidence. And again, I think, you know, the public is going to go, well, where were we in all this, right? And the province says, well, you know, we're there for you. But increasingly, they're not there for us. They're there to make it First Nation.
Right. Well, we're also seeing conflicts because of this, the way this is being handled, even within First Nations. We saw this week, the Squamish were quick to say, hey, we have claim to some of these same areas as the Musqueam. And we saw the same, obviously, with the Cowichan decision, which is being challenged by other First Nations.
And the Tawasin Band has weighed in because Delta is included. Look, there's 204 First Nations in British Columbia, or 206, and they've been here a long time. And they did not have the European idea of boundaries and, you know, legal boundaries and everything. They had traditional territory that's been accepted and it's not in dispute, but the boundaries between these traditional territories are not clearly defined. They're fluid. There's overlap, a lot of overlap. And what the courts have said is, well, title and rights should be established historically, and where there are written records, it is, but admissible is oral history within the First Nation. Well, it isn't surprising to me that with First Nations that are adjacent to each other, that one group's ancestors have a very different view of where the boundary is than the other. It's natural to me. And you saw that, you mentioned the Cowichan case. Well, right there is a dispute. The Musqueam and the Tawasin both dispute the court's finding that that was the traditional territory of the Cowichan Nation. They say, no, in their history, the Cowichan Nation had to get permission to fish there. It wasn't their fishing grounds. You've had the same thing this week with the Musqueam Aboriginal rights and title. Squamish and Tawasin have both stepped in and said, overlap. We don't agree with those boundaries. And yeah, I'm sure that, you know, and given enough time and enough lawyers, they can all be sorted out. And maybe it can be sorted out by negotiation too, but what we've heard, what we used to hear in the past, was that more than 100% of British Columbia is subject to claims of Aboriginal title. So there's more claims and more territory than there is land in British Columbia. Not going to be easy to sort that out. And again, you've got to bring the public along. They see this, and I think people are busy, eh? They got a lot of issues in their own lives, and they're going, well, who is the landlord in Vancouver? Musqueam? Squamish? Tawasin? Increasingly, it doesn't look like it's the provincial government.
I think it's Tsleil-Waututh, not Tawasin, I think, right?
Sorry, you're
Sorry,
right.
yeah, you're
Well,
right.
I
Yeah,
saw Tawasin as well because this thing spills over now into Delta, right?
right.
And
Well, in Kwantlen and any of the other
I mean, look,
suburban.
as I say, there's the federal government has recognized 204 First Nations. I mean, I always thought that was the irony with accepting the UN declaration. There are more First Nations recognized in British Columbia than there are members of the UN.
Interesting. All right, Vaughn, thank you. That was a great
Harold,
primer on
I
where
don't
we're
think
at.
this is going to go away, Harold. I think we might talk about this again.
Yes, and we will. Thank you, Vaughn.
Thanks. Okay.